Welcome to our channel, where we delve into the lesser-known aspects of history that have shaped our world today. In this video, we will explore the shocking effects of British rule in Africa, shedding light on the often overlooked consequences of colonialism. To understand the impact of British colonization in Africa, we must first look back at the history of how it all began. The British Empire's expansion into Africa was driven by a quest for power, resources, and economic dominance. Through a combination of military conquests, treaties, and manipulation, Britain established its rule over vast territories across the continent. The consequences of British rule on African societies and cultures were profound and far-reaching. The imposition of colonial boundaries disregarded existing tribal territories, leading to conflicts and divisions that continue to affect African nations today. The exploitation of natural resources, forced labor, and the introduction of cash crops disrupted traditional ways of life and economies, perpetuating cycles of poverty and dependency. It is crucial to recognize that the effects of colonialism extend beyond the physical and economic realms. The cultural impact of British rule in Africa cannot be understated, as indigenous languages, traditions, and belief systems were often suppressed or eradicated in favor of British norms and values. In this video, we will delve deeper into these topics, exploring the lasting legacy of British colonialism in Africa and the importance of understanding its implications for the present day. Join us on this journey as we uncover the hidden truths of history and strive to learn from the mistakes of the past. The Scramble for Africa. Unraveling the impact of European colonization. The late 19th century witnessed a frenzied race among European powers to carve up Africa for their own economic and political gain, a period known as the Scramble for Africa. At the heart of this scramble was the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, where European nations, including Britain, gathered to formalize the partitioning of Africa into spheres of influence and colonies. The Berlin Conference played a pivotal role in legitimizing the colonization of Africa by European powers. Borders were drawn without regard for existing tribal territories or cultural boundaries, leading to a legacy of artificial nations and ethnic tensions that persist to this day. The conference effectively paved the way for European domination and exploitation of the African continent. British imperialism in Africa was characterized by strategic expansion and economic motives. The British employed various tactics to extend their colonial empire, including military conquest, diplomacy, and alliances with local rulers. Through a combination of coercion and collaboration, Britain established control over vast territories in Africa, exploiting the region's resources and labor for its own benefit. Economic interests were a driving force behind British imperialism in Africa. The continent was seen as a source of valuable raw materials, such as gold, diamonds, and rubber, which fueled the Industrial Revolution in Britain. The establishment of cash crop plantations and mining operations further enriched the British Empire, while impoverishing African societies and disrupting local economies. In this video, we will delve into the complexities of the Scramble for Africa, exploring the lasting consequences of European colonization on the continent and the intricate web of political, economic, and social dynamics that continue to shape Africa's present-day reality. Join us as we unravel the impact of colonialism and strive to understand the complexities of our shared history. Cultural suppression and assimilation, unveiling the legacy of British colonial policies in Africa. British colonial policies in Africa were not only about economic exploitation and territorial control, but also about the suppression of African cultures and the promotion of assimilation into British norms and values. Missionary activities played a significant role in this process, as European missionaries sought to convert Africans to Christianity and eradicate traditional belief systems. The impact of missionary activities on African belief systems was profound. Indigenous spiritual practices and traditions were often demonized as pagan or primitive, leading to the erosion of cultural identities and the loss of ancestral knowledge. The imposition of Christianity as the dominant religion further marginalized African spiritual beliefs, creating a divide between traditional practices and the new faith brought by the missionaries. In addition to religious conversion, British colonial authorities enforced the use of English and other European languages in education and administration, further alienating Africans from their own cultural heritage. The imposition of Western education systems aimed to indoctrinate African youth with British values and perspectives, erasing local languages and histories from the curriculum. Despite these efforts to assimilate African societies into British culture, resistance movements emerged to challenge colonial oppression and preserve indigenous traditions. From grassroots movements to armed uprisings, Africans fought back against cultural suppression and demanded the right to maintain their own identities and ways of life. These resistance movements were a testament to the resilience and strength of African communities in the face of colonial domination. In this video, we will delve into the complexities of cultural suppression and assimilation under British colonial rule in Africa, exploring the lasting impact of these policies on African societies and the ongoing struggles for cultural preservation and self-determination. Join us as we uncover the hidden stories of resistance and resilience in the face of colonial oppression, resource exploitation and economic consequences, unveiling the legacy of British colonial rule in Africa. British rule in Africa was marked by the ruthless exploitation of the continent's abundant natural resources, leading to long-term economic consequences that continue to impact African nations today. The extraction of minerals, agricultural products, and other valuable resources played a central role in the economic agenda of the British Empire in Africa. The extraction of natural resources such as minerals and agricultural products was a key pillar of British colonial economic policy. African lands were rich in resources like gold, diamonds, copper, and rubber, which were plundered by British companies for export to fuel the Industrial Revolution in Europe. The exploitation of these resources led to environmental degradation, displacement of local populations, and the disruption of traditional livelihoods. One of the most significant economic legacies of British colonial rule in Africa was the development of cash crop economies. British colonizers introduced crops like tea, coffee, cotton, and tobacco for commercial production, displacing subsistence farming practices and creating a dependency on export-oriented agriculture. This shift towards cash crops had detrimental effects on local populations, as land was seized for plantations, leading to food insecurity and poverty among African communities. The disparities in wealth distribution between the colonizers and the colonized were stark under British rule. British companies and colonial administrators reaped immense profits from the exploitation of African resources, while the majority of the African population lived in poverty and deprivation. The unequal distribution of wealth and resources perpetuated social inequalities and reinforced the power dynamics of colonial domination. In this video, we will delve into the complex web of resource exploitation and economic consequences of British colonial rule in Africa, examining the lasting impact of these policies on African economies and societies. Join us as we uncover the hidden truths of economic exploitation and strive to understand the legacy of colonialism in shaping Africa's economic landscape. Political instability and legacy of divide and rule, uncovering the impact of British colonial policies in Africa. British colonial policies in Africa not only exploited the continent's resources, but also sowed the seeds of political instability and division through a strategy of divide and rule. The creation of artificial borders, manipulation of traditional power structures, and fostering of ethnic tensions were all tactics employed by the British to maintain control and exploit African societies. The British colonial administration drew arbitrary borders across Africa, disregarding existing tribal territories and cultural boundaries. This act of cartographic imperialism led to the fragmentation of cohesive communities and the imposition of artificial nations that often encompassed diverse ethnic groups with historical animosities. The legacy of these artificial borders continues to fuel ethnic tensions and conflicts in post-independence African nations. Indirect rule was another key strategy used by the British to govern their African colonies. By co-opting existing traditional power structures and rulers, the British were able to exert control over vast territories with minimal resources. However, this system of indirect rule often exacerbated divisions within African societies, as rival factions vied for British favor and resources, leading to power struggles and internal conflicts. The long-term effects of colonial-era divisions on post-independence African nations are profound. The legacy of divide and rule has left a legacy of political fragmentation, ethnic rivalries, and power struggles that continue to plague African countries to this day. The manipulation of traditional power structures by the British has also contributed to authoritarianism, corruption, and instability in many post-colonial states. In this video, we will explore how British colonial policies contributed to political instability and the legacy of divide and rule in Africa. examining the lasting impact of these strategies on the political landscape of the continent. Join us as we uncover the hidden truths of colonial manipulation and strive to understand the complexities of post-colonial governance in Africa. Resistance and independence movements, the fight against British colonial rule in Africa. Throughout the history of British colonial rule in Africa, a wave of resistance and independence movements emerged, challenging the oppressive policies and exploitation imposed by the British Empire. Key figures such as Jomo Kenyatta and Kwame Nkrumah played pivotal roles in leading these movements and advocating for the liberation of African nations from colonial domination. Jomo Kenyatta, a prominent leader in the Kenyan independence movement, fought tirelessly against British colonial rule and the injustices faced by the Kenyan people. His advocacy for land rights, political representation, and self-determination inspired a generation of Kenyan nationalists to rise up against British authority and demand independence for their country. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana and a leading figure in the Pan-African movement, spearheaded Ghana's independence struggle and became a symbol of African unity and liberation. Nkrumah's vision of a united Africa free from colonial oppression galvanized support across the continent and inspired other African nations to pursue independence from their colonial masters. African nationalists employed various strategies to challenge British authority, including non-violent protests, civil disobedience, armed resistance, and diplomatic negotiations. These movements mobilized people from all walks of life, including students, workers, farmers, and intellectuals, in a collective effort to dismantle the structures of colonialism and assert African agency and sovereignty. Pan-Africanism played a significant role in the decolonization process, advocating for African unity, solidarity, and self-determination. The Pan-African movement brought together leaders and activists from across the continent to collaborate on strategies for liberation, foster cross-border solidarity, and envision a future free from colonial oppression and exploitation. In this video, we will highlight the courage and resilience of the resistance and independence movements that emerged in response to British colonial rule in Africa, celebrating the contributions of key figures like Jomo Kenyatta and Kwame Nkrumah, and exploring the significance of Pan-Africanism in the struggle for liberation and self-determination. Join us as we honor the legacy of African freedom fighters and their enduring impact on the history of decolonization. Conclusion: reflecting on the impact of British colonialism in Africa. As we conclude our exploration of the shocking effects of British rule in Africa, it is crucial to reflect on the lasting consequences of colonialism and the importance of understanding this complex history. British colonial policies in Africa had far-reaching impacts on the continent, from economic exploitation and cultural suppression to political instability and social division. Recapping the key consequences of British colonialism, we have seen how the extraction of natural resources, imposition of Western education systems, and manipulation of traditional power structures have left a legacy of poverty, inequality, and conflict in many African nations. The scars of colonialism continue to shape the socio-economic and political landscape of Africa, underscoring the need for critical reflection and action. We encourage viewers to delve deeper into this topic through further research, discussions, and engagement with diverse perspectives on colonial history. By seeking out alternative narratives, amplifying marginalized voices, and challenging conventional understandings of the past, we can work towards a more nuanced and inclusive understanding of the impact of British rule in Africa. We invite viewers to engage with the content by subscribing to our channel, liking this video, and sharing it with others who may benefit from learning about this important chapter in history. By raising awareness, fostering dialogue, and advocating for justice and reconciliation, we can honor the resilience of African communities and strive towards a more equitable and just future for all. Thank you for joining us on this journey of discovery and reflection. Together, let us continue to learn, grow, and take action towards a more informed and compassionate world.